the idea is to find ways, sort of big and small, to empower them.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and co-author of the What Every Child Needs to Know series of board books for pre-readers. My guest this episode is Sheryl Cababa. Sheryl is the Chief Design Officer at Substantial, which is an insights design and development firm based out of Seattle, Washington. Sheryl and her colleagues are working with amazing partners like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and using equity-centered research to improve education technology. Sheryl and I discuss what equity-centered research is and how it might benefit the kids in your life. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
My background is in user experience design and design thinking. And so I've always kind of worked as both a researcher and strategist in that field. And so what that means is, if you think about like the design thinking approach, it's really a process that emphasizes interactions with and validation with end users. Like if you're designing products, for example, it emphasizes interactions with end users and validating with them just kind of continuously throughout the process. And then it's also iterative. So you work to understand people's context, the context in which your products or services might fit. And then you use that to kind of define and ideate kind of based on essentially the problems that you're trying to solve. And then you quickly prototype things and then test them again with end users.
Okay.
And so this has always been kind of a core part of my practice. And as we've been focused in my practice at Substantial, which is a design research and strategy and software development firm, we have been working more around the needs of historically under-resourced populations and communities. And so that's where our focus on equity comes in. So when we're conducting research for education, we tend to focus on students and communities who have been marginalized in decision making and education. So, for example, many of the clients we work with, many of whom are in philanthropy, have us focusing, for example, on how Black students experience math. And what that means is that we then conduct research with, and also we engage in participatory design with students and families and teachers and educators who serve that community. And so a lot of what we do is really oriented around how can we engage with what we have historically called research participants, but now we refer to as lived experts. How can we engage with lived experts in a meaningful way that is reciprocal, that isn't just extractive, and that kind of benefits both parties?
So when you're thinking about kind of equity-centered research specifically around education, I heard you mention what I presume are a few of the principles of it. But what do you consider the principles? What makes research equity-centered as opposed to how it had been done in the past or how it's being done other places?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Like as I kind of referred to before, like oftentimes I'm a designer, so like designers have sort of traditionally viewed themselves as, um, I don't know, kind of being agnostic to problem spaces
Mm,
and as well as solution types, as well as who your users are or who you're designing for. And the idea is that designers have a certain level of expertise that they can bring to the table. And just learning about people's contexts and problems allow us to like kind of go off and design
okay.
for people and then come back and be like, here, we've kind of solved your problems.
Right.
And I think when we think about um, redefining what it means to do this in an equity centered way, it means one, sort of interrogating your own privilege and position.
Hmm.
Like designers are in a powerful position and they can kind of
Right.
like make decisions, their work is funded, etc. Um, and better distributing some of that power to the lived experts who you're learning from and who will be kind of like the potential beneficiaries of or
Hmm.
users of the things that you're tasked with designing and integrating them more in the process.
Right.
And that starts with kind of like interviewing them in a way that is meaningful to them as well as to you. So engaging in kind of like less extractive methods.
You mentioned these extractive methods. Something else that I've been hearing a lot about, actually, a couple of the guests on the podcast have talked about this as well, is that an equity-centered approach to research not only involving the subject matter, the partner, the lived experience experts that you're talking about in the design of the research, but also in the interpretation of the findings after they've been kind of extracted. Is that a part of your process as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we are kind of learning about students' context, so like I had mentioned, we do a lot of work oriented around um, how do we, I guess, intervene in the system
Hmm.
to create solutions that will help improve student outcomes in math, for example. And so oftentimes our projects start with trying to understand students' context. So like, how are you experiencing math today? What are kind of like the quote unquote pain points of how of your math experience. Can you kind of like walk us through like what you've been learning this year or what have you? And then the idea is that we might still go off and kind of like generate some potential ideas, but then use that as a starting point for lived experts to come back into the process and
Okay.
kind of like look at the ideas we
Right.
come up with as well as like ideate further, right? Um, and I think the idea is that they don't have to just be confined to us interpreting their experiences. They can be part of the process as
Right.
well. And so I think that's kind of like an important shift in thinking, especially for people who kind of like design products and services that are meant to be used in education.
Well, can you share some of the things that you've learned in conducting this kind of equity-centered research, specifically in education?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like part of our focus or part of our philosophy is kind of taking a strengths-based approach to those that, we're engaging with.
Right.
So, we do basically some systems analysis to kind of like understand how people are being impacted by the system. But as we're especially engaging with those who are most impacted and maybe have the least decision making power. And in education, it basically boils down to students. And the idea is to find ways, sort of big and small, to empower them, like during our own process.
Okay.
So what that might mean is like we look, we still have to understand students' context, right? If we're kind of learning about how they're learning, and that means interviewing them.
Hmm.
But we also do things like we allow them to kind of choose how they want to engage with us. So even if they're doing an interview, we might have a series of activities that they can engage in beforehand or during the interview. That is that is somewhat participatory and also kind of like um, creative output. So,
Right.
for example, like we do some work in post-secondary, and we've had students, for example, create a vision board about what they want out of like the coming year, in terms of whatever the central problem space that we're kind of engaging in. So if we're talking about like, oh, they're taking gateway courses or something like that,
Right.
then they would create kind of like a vision board around how they would want to do or how they imagine themselves engaging in that. And then also just kind of like doing some, um, these are some, we call them cultural activities. So it's like kind of like just activities to kind of engage with these lived experts as like as a whole person, like
Mm-hmm.
how who is their support community, for example. Can you create like a map that kind of shows who your support community is? And these sometimes, I think, to those outside of the process might feel like not directly related to like
Mm.
our problem solving, but they're really important to sort of like our contextual understanding of what people are experiencing. And then
Right.
also it's a good reminder that people have different kinds of perceptions of themselves, different kinds of identities. Like it's really hard to like bucket people into groups, like kind of based on their individual experiences. But that allows kind of the patterns in our research to jump out even more readily, is like all of these people have like really unique experiences when you understand them qualitatively, but then there's going to be some patterns in terms of how they might be affected by the system or their consistent experiences. um in math, like we've had a lot of eighth graders tell us like, I just don't see what makes algebra useful.
Mm-hmm.
And as we kind of like probe into that, there's kind of like a lack of cultural relevance for them. There's also kind of like a lack of them understanding, um, being able to connect the point of what they're learning to how it might contribute to their success later in life. And it's just kind of like those kinds of things start jumping out. And I think part of it is just because we do try to develop this like holistic understanding of the students that we're kind of working with and interviewing and conducting research with.
So you're telling me that students want to know why they're being asked to do something that they're doing in school. That's incredible. I can't imagine that people would want to know. If I'm sounding a little disingenuous, and this is a theme that we see a lot. So people who are regular listeners of the Talking About Kids podcast, they know that this comes up time and time again. There's so many research studies and so many experiences that show that kids say, when asked, that they believe that they would do better in the subject and enjoy it more if they knew why they were being asked to learn
Mhm.
these things. Just incredible.
Yeah.
Any other aha moments from your research?
I mean, it's kind of interesting just continuing on that thread, like from a meta perspective that applies to us conducting research
Yeah.
too. Is like, I think, um, explaining to kids that we're conducting research with, like why we're doing it and what it's going to
Yeah.
lead to, and then them being able to see the output later, as well as like have even more
Yeah.
influence on the output later, is really meaningful. And we've definitely had students like ask us like, how can I mean, how did you end up doing what you do? Like,
Yeah.
how can I
Yeah.
do that?
Right.
How can I do it too? And so that's sort of like meaningful engagement from their side, where it's like it flies in the face a little bit of, in terms of like what you might learn about conducting traditional research. I mean, we also share a lot about ourselves
Right.
too. So like we, will like share our own
Hmm.
experiences with students. I think like, yeah, these kinds of like reciprocal things that we do with them might not feel like just research. Like
Hmm.
it's not like we're trying to maintain any like neutrality or anything like that. And in fact, like, we make sure we have representation on our team when
Hmm.
we're um conducting research with specific communities, whether like language based or uh racially or
Hmm.
ethnically, or just like in terms of having like a shared background of some sort. And we kind of make sure like we have that kind of representation on our team, and that the folks on our team who are engaging with students can actually kind of share their experiences back with them too. And I think that just like opens up like a dialogue that is really interesting. And it, again, it applies to that sort of why that just people in general crave. Like, before kind of engaging in this in my current like equity centered design practice, oftentimes we would be conducting research, when I was kind of working on conducting research for like product design
Hmm.
in different domains. We'd just be conducting research, and like you'd never really explain to like research participants like what you were doing or why you're trying to learn about like how they conduct their banking or whatever. And you'd be really vague about it. And I think it's like I really like the way that I get to work now, where like we get to kind of share what we're doing with the people who we're learning from,
Right.
and who with whom like we couldn't do this work without. So I think it's like really acknowledging that at every step has been really important for myself and my team.
So far, are you getting the interpretations right? Or when you share back with your subjects, have they ever pushed back and said, "No, that's not the right way to think about this"?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, like, I think, for example, like there's a tool that's used oftentimes in the design practice, and
Mhm.
it's called personas, right? Like you develop personas, and then designers and developers can use that later on. Let's say you're creating an ed tech product, you can use that later on to kind of make decisions about the
Right.
direction your product takes or what have you. We were working on a project recently where we were tasked with creating personas, and instead of creating personas, we decided like personas kind of I don't know, minimize who people are as humans.
Hmm.
Like they don't feel very nuanced. Oftentimes there's like 3 to 5 of them or something, and
Right.
it just feels like very reductive. So we created a toolkit. So it's like different experiences that you could mix and match that we had heard kind of patterns about. Different representations of who support networks were. And this was for post secondary students. And we basically took the drafts of this toolkit back to students, and we're like, yeah, okay, you're going to help like us workshop this and like help us get it right. This is meant, you're meant to be able to find yourself somewhere in here or find people that
Right.
you know. And they're like really open to like calling us out on things
Hmm.
that we got wrong. Like, yeah, I wouldn't use this language. So for example, we stopped using the language of like dropped out um of like, college
Hmm.
or university, and we ended up, kind of describing as being pushed out.
Mm.
And I think that
Hmm.
really resonated with students, like, because that's how they felt. Like they
Right.
felt really like pushed out, like by like the lack of support, by, like it sort of redistributes like the onus of
Yeah.
what happened to them to the system. And it's not just like on their own shoulders, like they made this like really independent decision. Like, and that,
Right.
I think that is how you can best problem solve in like spaces that are complex, that have multi layers of potentially navigating and intervening in the problem. Um, and how do you solve, like how do you keep students from feeling like they need to drop out?
Right.
Like, and they're kind of like, well, how do you how do you keep institutions from making students feel like they're being pushed out of the system? And that reframing really helped, the institutions and kind of the stakeholders we were working with to be able to kind of take a really systems oriented lens to the problem. So I think it's just kind of like things like that that make it really beneficial to go back to your, participants and lived experts and like just make sure you're getting it right.
I mean, that's so interesting. There's so much that I want to say about that, but I think I want to ask if you think this is working. Is this equity-centered approach to education research, is it benefiting kids, and how do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, it's like a long haul process.
Right.
So a lot of the work that we're doing isn't necessarily contributing to a direct, I don't know, product. And as we know, anyone who works in education knows, like, there's no like product you could create that's like a magic bullet
Right.
for like improving student outcomes overnight. So a lot of the work actually, we work with philanthropies who are investing in the space, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And a lot of our work in equity centered design and research is oriented towards helping to inform their investment strategies.
Yeah.
So, what are some potential intervention areas or solution areas or what have you that would make sense as they navigate the problem space and kind of think about who to invest in, where to invest their money, like what kinds of initiatives to spin up. And so I think in that regard, making sure that basically student voice, like the kids themselves, like their voices are kind of elevated, like within this process, um, is feels directly meaningful. Like I don't necessarily have metrics to like point to and to say like, oh yeah, this has resulted in these kinds of decisions, whereas if we didn't do this, it would result in something else. But I do think it's like it is keeping students and like the kids who are typically least powerful in this type of decision making, like where a huge, organization puts their money. There's something like really empowering about that, like for the students that we work with. And then also just like it's a reminder to all our stakeholders that they need to be engaging with students who are going to be affected by this, by their decisions all throughout the process. And not just like be like, hey, we're trying to improve these improve this for you. It kind of like minimizes the whole like savior language. That kind of happens in those spaces.
How do you balance? So I just had a discussion about this the other night with a member of the National Academy of Education, and I've had guests on that talk about, and particularly with children that have experienced adversity and trauma, they're often, we all are as humans, often unreliable narrators of our own experiences and motivations, right? We sometimes, we now know that emotion kind of precedes cognition a lot of times. So how do you balance that? How do you balance a student's own beliefs about why they're doing something with the understanding that none of us sometimes know why we do what we do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the way that we try to keep perspective on our projects is we have kind of this Venn diagram of like systems thinking and kind of intersected with this like empathic sort of approach to like working with students. So it's like you're understanding their experiences, perspectives, motivations, context on the one hand, but then we're also doing this work to kind of understand like what is happening in the system. And what that means is like we often engage with experts, like academic experts who kind of understand that systems lens, like who are experts, for example, like, you know, in a recent project, like we worked really heavily with experts in sort of math and social justice to kind of like understand their you know, their take on the system within that space. And I think that helps kind of inform like what what we can best take away from our engagement like with students, as well as like have this overarching understanding of the entirety of the space. Because like as a student, like they don't know about like they're not going to be able to like talk to us about like the decisions of policymakers
Sure.
and how that has an impact
Right.
on like
Right.
the way that they're assessed,
Right.
right, in math.
Right.
So us being able to kind of like get that lens in terms of like, you know, parallel work within our projects kind of helps us stay grounded in like what's happening more broadly. And I know we're all unreliable narrators, but because we make decisions emotionally, I think part of what we are really trying to capture are students and yeah, basically their emotional responses, their perceptions, because that does kind of drive, you know, whether they experience success or not. Like that's a part to acknowledge and not a part, as far as we're concerned, to like minimize,
Okay.
because I think that's part of like that's core to why we're engaging them in the first place is to
Okay.
be able to like understand how they view things.
So, so their feelings about different issues are encouraged. You're encouraging them to talk about their feelings, their gut reactions to things.
Yeah, yeah, because that has an impact, you know, to go back to my example within the post-secondary system, that contributes to like whether they feel like they need to leave school, whether they feel like they
Right.
need to, you know, quote unquote drop out, or, you know, have this like underlying sense of being pushed out. Like that problem is not just a perceived problem, it's actually a real
Right.
problem. And so how do we, you know, kind of keep, or how do we address kind of those kinds of emotional responses as well through the ways that we kind of intervene in the problem space? So it's not just like somebody who's objectively not experiencing success, right? Like maybe they're failing their classes or something like that, but they're also feeling like they're failing their classes, right? And the, like those both of those things are equally important
Right.
to in some sense.
Well, Cheryl, I want to thank you so much for your work elevating the voice of kids through your equity-centered approach to educational research. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm always happy to talk about this.
That was Sheryl Cababa. For more information about Sheryl, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young children. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.